enter a realm where the wind carries mournful cries, where ancient Gothic shadows guard forbidden secrets, and the air is thick with dread. This is Tales for a Dark Night. One. The Bells of Grimsby Asylum. Grimsby Asylum stood on the edge of the marshlands like a great monolith of despair, its soot-stained walls rising out of the fog like the ribs of a carcass half sunken in mire. It had once been a military barracks, but after the cholera outbreaks of 1849, the government converted it into an institution for the mentally ill. The result was a structure both prison and tomb, where the cries of the forgotten echoed like organ tones across the damp stone. Dr. Theodore Archer arrived at the asylum in November of 1881, summoned by a letter marked with the seal of the crown. He was a rising figure in psychiatric medicine and had been appointed to investigate a series of unexplained deaths within the facility. Patients found dead in their locked rooms, no signs of trauma or violence, but faces twisted in terror, mouths frozen in screams. The local papers had begun referring to the matter as the Grimsby Curse. Upon his arrival, Archer was greeted by Matron Lyle, a woman with the pallor of spoiled cream and eyes that never seemed to blink. She walked him down a corridor lined with iron-barred doors and murmuring mouths, the gaslight flickering in time with the damp wind that crept beneath the floorboards. "The patients speak of the bells," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Always the bells, even when none have rung in years." Archer paused. "The tower's bell is disused." She nodded. "Removed after the fire in 1872. The chapel below was gutted. No one stepped foot inside it since. And yet they still hear it. Every night, Doctor. At midnight." Archer took residence in the physician's quarters, a narrow chamber with a rusted basin, a feather mattress, and a single narrow window that looked out upon the marsh. At night, the fog rolled in so thick it pressed against the glass like a smothering hand. The first death occurred 2 nights into his stay. A woman in the West Wing, patient number 49, was found slumped against the door of her padded room, blood leaking from her ears. Her expression had not changed since rigor set in, eyes wide, lips peeled back, as though she had heard something unbearable. Her fingernails were torn. She had tried to claw her ears out. The autopsy was inconclusive. Her brain was unmarred, her body untouched by disease or poison. Archer asked the orderlies what they had heard during the night. "Only the bells, sir," one said with a trembling jaw, "like the whole tower come back to life." That evening, Archer stayed awake in the corridor outside the West Wing. Midnight came, and with it, nothing. But then, faint as breath, a sound carried through the stone, the soft tolling of a bell. Not one, but several. 3 notes, evenly spaced. A pattern. But it came not from above, as a bell in the tower might. It came from beneath. He followed the sound down into the cellar with a lantern in hand. The air grew colder the further he descended, and the flame quivered violently. The brick passage narrowed into a series of arched chambers, long unused, until he found a rusted door carved with a single word: Vox. It groaned as he opened it. Inside lay the remains of the old chapel, scorched pews, a collapsed altar. stained glass windows shattered from heat and time. And yet in the center of the blackened floor sat something untouched. An iron bell, no taller than a man's knee, its surface engraved with Latin prayers and strange sigils. A rope hung from its yoke, freshly coiled. Archer knelt to examine it. There were no signs it had been struck recently, but then he noticed the stone around its base, dark, damp, almost pulsing, as though the bell did not ring by being struck, but by being fed. Behind him, the wind moved through the broken glass like a dying breath. He turned and saw, just for a moment, the silhouette of a figure watching him from the shadows of the ruined apse. The next night, another patient died, and the bells rang again. Archer began interviewing the patients. Most were incoherent or too terrified to speak, but one, an old man named Father Coyle, who had been admitted a decade prior, offered him a tale. The bell was never meant to summon, the priest hissed. It was meant to bind. The monks buried something in that place, long before the asylum was built. The bell was forged to hold it. They rang it every night to keep it asleep. But then the fire came, and the ringing stopped. What was buried? Archer asked. Father Coyle began to weep. They call it the throat that remembers, a voice that speaks in every language, all at once. It climbs into the head. It knows your sins. It makes them sing. It's hungry for the weak, the desperate, the mad. Archer dismissed him, but unease festered like mildew in his gut. That night, he returned to the chapel. The bell stood still. He placed a hand upon it. It was warm. A scream rose behind him. A patient. Then another. He ran back to the upper levels. 2 more dead. This time, one of the orderlies. Blood pooled beneath their heads. On the wall, written in that same blood, were words no sane man would write. Let it ring. It remembers. By dawn, the asylum was in uproar. Patients shrieked in unison. Windows shattered without cause. Rats swarmed the cellars. Something old had begun to breathe beneath the floor. In desperation, Archer descended into the chapel one last time. He brought tools, chains, iron spikes. He meant to shatter the bell, to silence it forever. But as he approached, he saw the figure again. No longer in shadow. It was Martha Lyle, but her face was wrong, stretched, hollowed. Her mouth hung open as though her jaw had been broken and never set. From it, the sound of the bell issued, not rung but spoken. 3 tolls, the rhythm of madness. Archer stumbled backward, tripping over bones now rising from the scorched floor. Arms, ribs, skulls, all arrayed in patterns, as though buried as offerings. The pulsing beneath his feet intensified. He tried to crawl away, but his limbs failed. The bell rang once more, and this time, Archer understood its song. It sang of murder, of a boy left to die in the asylum's walls, of experiments, of guilt, of blood. It sang his sins. When they found him the next morning, he was still alive, but insensate. Mouth agape, eyes ruptured. Blood poured from his ears, nose, and lips. On the wall of his room, scrawled in his own blood, was a single phrase, "I heard them too." The asylum was condemned and sealed the following year. But locals say that when the fog rolls in, thick over the marsh, you can still hear the bells of Grimsby Asylum tolling faintly across the moorland, always 3 times, and always from below. Two. The Waxen Bride. The legend of the Waxen Bride was whispered in hushed tones around hearths and tavern tables in the outskirts of Whitford, a grey English town that seemed to forever crouch under low skies. Children were warned never to linger near the old mortuary house at the edge of the graveyard, for there, it was said, a bride carved from wax kept eternal vigil, her glassy eyes waiting for a groom who would never come. The story was a curiosity for most, no more than a fireside fancy. But for Jonathan Balmore, an undertaker's apprentice recently come into the employ of grim Master Laughlin, the legend soon proved terribly real. Jonathan had always harbored an unhealthy fascination with death, not the grief of it, but the stillness, the artistry of preservation. Wax figures in traveling carnivals had enchanted him as a child, their lifelike skin and frozen smiles seeming closer to immortality than the flesh of the living. Thus, when he began his work at Laughlin's mortuary, he found a perverse satisfaction in dressing corpses, combing hair, arranging hands. He whispered apologies to them as he worked, though a secret part of him thrilled at the idea that he commanded their final appearance before the world. It was during a particularly brutal winter in 1889 that the Waxen Bride was delivered. Her name had been Evelyn Ashcombe, a young heiress set to marry the son of a wealthy merchant. She had died suddenly the night before her wedding, struck by a fever, some said, or perhaps poisoned by a rival suitor, though the physician called it a failure of the lungs. When her body arrived at the mortuary, Jonathan was struck dumb by her beauty. She was as pale as alabaster, her hair dark and flowing, and though death's chill had settled in her limbs, her lips still held the faintest blush. She had been sent to them in her wedding gown, lace-veiled, pearls at her throat. She looked less a corpse than a statue toppled from some cathedral niche. Master Laughlin gave curt instructions. The body was to be preserved for an extended viewing. The Ashcombe family wanted her remembered as she would have looked upon her wedding day. Embalming fluid was scarce, and the frigid air made it impossible to properly preserve flesh. But Laughlin was a man of strange methods, and he brought out his stock of wax. Beeswax, he explained, mixed with certain oils and powders that could be molded to the skin, filling the hollows, smoothing the pallor. Jonathan watched as his master's gnarled fingers pressed the warm wax to Evelyn's cheeks, sealing away the signs of death beneath a surface eerily lifelike. Soon the work was passed to Jonathan. Hour after hour he shaped and smoothed, until Evelyn's face seemed to glow, her eyelids soft and delicate, her lips faintly parted. He waxed her hands, her slender fingers interlaced around a wilted bouquet, sealing the fragile petals in place. It was painstaking, holy work to him, though he felt his breath quicken, as if standing in the presence of something forbidden. At last, when the wax cooled and hardened, Evelyn appeared not merely preserved, but transformed, perfected, as though she had never belonged to the grave at all. She was the Waxen Bride. The viewing was scheduled for 3 days later, but Evelyn was never taken from the mortuary. That night, Jonathan dreamed of her. He saw her rise from the embalming table, veil trailing, her waxen face gleaming like candlelight. She did not speak, but she reached out, her fingers tacky and warm, and pressed them to his lips. He awoke gasping, sweat chilled on his skin, the scent of beeswax clinging to the air. In the days that followed, odd things occurred. Candles near the mortuary burned lower than they should, their wax seeming to vanish into the air. Jonathan noticed Evelyn's position, shifting ever so slightly when he returned to the workroom, her head tilted differently, her hands parted. Once, he found the bouquet on the floor, petals crushed, though no one had entered. Master Laughlin muttered only that the dead often clung to their earthly desires, and bade Jonathan to ignore it. But Jonathan could not ignore the sensation that Evelyn watched him, her sealed eyelids twitching, her chest faintly rising, as if breath were struggling behind the wax. One stormy night, left alone in the mortuary while his master tended to a burial, Jonathan succumbed to his obsession. He drew back Evelyn's veil and kissed her waxen lips. The kiss left a trace of oily tallow on his mouth, but in that moment he thought he felt warmth, the faint press of yielding flesh. Shuddering, he whispered that he loved her, that she was too beautiful for death. Her head seemed to incline ever so slightly in answer. That night, his dream was more vivid. She walked toward him in her gown, arms outstretched, her body dripping molten wax that spattered to the floor in smoking pools. She whispered in a voice thick and slow, like honey poured from a jar, "Marry me." When Jonathan awoke, his pillow was damp with wax. The next evening, a terrible accident befell Master Laughlin. He slipped on the ice outside the mortuary, striking his skull on the stone step. Jonathan did not call for help. He locked the doors, drew the curtains, and returned to Evelyn. Alone now, he dressed her in fresh garlands, polished her skin with scented oils, and sat beside her for hours, whispering vows no priest would sanctify. He became gaunt, sleepless, subsisting on bread and candle drippings, as though consuming wax would bind him to her. The villagers began to notice the smell, the cloying odor of hot tallow that seeped from the mortuary, the flickering light that glowed from its windows long past midnight. One dared to peek inside and fled shrieking. For within, the waxen bride no longer lay silent. She stood, towering, her gown fused with hardened drips, her limbs elongated, her face smooth and eyeless. The wax stretched taut where Jonathan had kissed it away. And Jonathan, poor Jonathan, was bound in her embrace, his body encased, layer upon layer of molten wax poured over him, until only his face remained visible, mouth open in a frozen scream. Together they stood, an obscene effigy of matrimony, bride and groom sculpted in oozing candle flesh. By dawn the room was filled with waxen figures, twisted forms of villagers who had entered, drawn in by the smell, captured in mid-gesture, as the bride reached out her dripping hands. To this day, the mortuary of Whitford is sealed, its windows blackened, yet on certain nights, the townsfolk swear they see a faint, flickering glow inside. And if one dares to press ear to the door, a low, thick voice can be heard intoning a vow, endlessly repeated, "Until death do us part." Three. The Pale Guest. The snow had not ceased for 3 days, and Laurel Manor seemed half buried beneath the drifts, its gables and turrets crowned with frost, its windows black against the grey-white world outside. Within, the hearths burned low, their light no match for the gloom that pressed against the leaded panes. Lady Eleanor Laurel, recently widowed, had summoned a small circle of acquaintances to keep the season from sinking her into despair, for the manor was far too large, and grief has a way of magnifying silence. It was on Christmas Eve that the guest arrived. The household had gathered in the great hall, Eleanor, her brother-in-law Henry, the solicitor Mr. Carrow, and 2 young women of the village, Miss Harker and her cousin Jane. The fire crackled, mulled wine steamed, and outside the wind keened like something alive. When the knocker sounded upon the front door, all turned in surprise, for no one expected callers through such a storm. The butler, Mr. Hobbs, shuffled to the entry. When he returned, he carried a pale figure in his arms, A man collapsed upon the threshold. His hair, long and white as bleached flax, hung in wet strands about his gaunt face. His skin was so bloodless it seemed translucent, as if frost had crept beneath it. Yet his eyes, opening weakly, shone dark and sharp, like coals in snow. He begged shelter, Hobbs muttered, laying him upon the settle by the fire. Eleanor, ever charitable, commanded that he be tended. They wrapped him in blankets, pressed a cup of wine to his lips. His hands trembled as he drank, but his gaze never wavered from Eleanor. When at last he spoke, his voice was smooth and low, yet carried an odd lilt, like an accent none of them could place. "You have saved me from the storm. I shall not forget such kindness." He gave no name, but when asked where he had come from, he merely smiled, revealing teeth too sharp for comfort, though none remarked upon it. He said he had been traveling alone, bound for the northern coast, when the snow overtook him. He did not explain why he had no horse, no carriage, no baggage. Out of politeness, they did not press. As the evening lengthened, the atmosphere of the gathering changed. The fire burned strangely dim. The air grew cold, no matter how much coal was heaped upon the grate. Shadows lengthened against the carved panels, and the guests drew their cloaks tighter. Only the pale stranger seemed comfortable. He sat upright now, eyes gliding over each face in turn, lingering longest on Eleanor. She felt her grief soften beneath that gaze, as though her sorrow were a veil he might gently lift. At supper, he ate nothing. The others laughed nervously, insisting he must be weak still from the storm. Yet, as the courses passed, the pallor of their own faces deepened. Caro complained of dizziness. Jane shivered uncontrollably, though sweat beaded her brow. The guest looked on with serene detachment, his lips curving into the faintest smile. By midnight, the household had dwindled into silence. Henry, red with wine, had collapsed into a chair. Caro excused himself to his chamber, clutching his stomach. Jane had fainted altogether. Miss Harker muttered prayers under her breath, and Eleanor found herself alone by the fire with the pale guest. He leaned close, so near she could smell the chill of winter clinging to him, and whispered, "The house grieves, my lady. The stones remember death. Do you feel it? The emptiness waiting to be filled?" Eleanor's heart thudded. She thought of her late husband, of the endless nights spent in mourning. The guest's words slid into that hollow space, promising not comfort, but release. "Who are you?" she whispered. He only smiled, showing again those two sharp teeth. A guest, one who lingers where sorrow calls. Then the bell in the tower struck midnight. At the first toll, Henry gasped in his sleep, his eyes fluttering wide with terror before his body stiffened, unmoving. At the second toll, a scream echoed down the corridor, Caro's voice cut short. At the third, Jane's body convulsed, her eyes rolling back as blood trickled from her nose. By the fourth, silence reclaimed the house, broken only by the tolling bell. Eleanor staggered to her feet. "What have you done?" The guest rose too, towering, though his frame was gaunt. His eyes burned darker now, his skin nearly luminescent. "They are taken, my lady, but not by me. The house claimed them, as it has claimed so many. I am only the witness, the companion." He reached out a long hand. "But you need not be alone in your grief." She recoiled, yet found her back pressed to the wall. The pale hand brushed her cheek. Cold spread from his touch, a cold that seeped into her marrow. For a moment she thought of surrender, of laying down sorrow and fear, of joining her husband in the earth. But then Miss Harker, trembling and pale, stumbled forward, clutching a poker from the hearth. With a cry, she swung it at the stranger. The iron connected with a sound not of bone, but of cracking ice. The guest staggered back, hissing, his form wavering as though made of smoke and frost. For an instant, his face seemed to dissolve, leaving only hollow sockets burning with dark fire. The wind howled through the hall as the great door burst open. Snow blasted in, and with it, the pale guest was gone, vanished into the night, leaving only a drift of frost upon the flagstones. The survivors never spoke of it again. Henry, Caro, and Jane were buried together in the Laurel Crypt. Lady Eleanor left the manor within the month, never to return. Miss Harker lived on, but her hair turned white before her 30th year. And yet each winter on Christmas Eve, the villagers swear the knocker of Laurel Manor sounds, though the house lies empty. Some say a pale figure stands upon the threshold, waiting to be let in, always waiting. For grief is a door forever ajar, and the guest returns where sorrow dwells. The Devil's Music Box. In the shadowed alleys of London's East End, where fog crawls like a living serpent through the gaslit streets, and the cries of the destitute mingle with the shriek of iron wheels, there was once a trinket whispered of with fear, though it seemed at first no more than a curious bauble, a music box of exquisite make, said to sing with the devil's own tune. Its history, like all infernal relics, was born of crime and wickedness. In the year of our Lord, 1847, a clockmaker named Erasmus Bligh plied his trade near Spitalfields. A man of solitary habit and sallow countenance, he was shunned by his neighbours, who whispered that his family hailed from Romani stock and trafficked in forbidden arts. Though he crafted ordinary clocks for ordinary folk, his true passion lay in darker mechanisms, things wrought not for timekeeping, but for enchantment. It was said he had once bargained with a stranger who bore no shadow, and from that bargain came the device he would call la lanterne du diable, though it was no lantern, but a music box. The box was fashioned of blackened oak, inlaid with brass so delicately wrought that when a candle shone upon it, grotesque figures of demons and angels seemed to writhe upon its surface. Within was a mechanism of silver teeth and tiny hammers, each shaped like a bone, though no man could say from what creature they were carved. When its key was turned and the lid opened, the tune it produced was unlike any melody known to human ears. The notes did not merely sound, they pierced, they sank into marrow, they compelled. Bligh's first experiment was upon a pauper boy, whom he lured to his workshop with bread. Setting the box upon the bench, he wound it thrice, and as the dreadful tune began to play, the boy stiffened, his eyes rolling white. He danced then, jerkily, grotesquely, until blood burst from his lips and he fell lifeless. Bligh recorded the experiment with satisfaction, declaring the box an instrument of dominion. In the weeks that followed, cats, dogs, and even beggars were found dead near his shop, their bodies twisted as if they had waltzed themselves into the grave. But Bligh grew careless. The constabulary, long suspicious of his solitary hours and the screams heard by night, came to arrest him. He fled into the rookeries, the music box clutched tight against his chest. For 3 days, he vanished into London's underbelly, until his body was discovered floating in the Thames, his face contorted in a rictus grin, his limbs stiff as though still in the throes of an eternal jig. The box was not upon him. Thereafter it appeared and vanished like a curse. A pawnbroker near Whitechapel claimed it and set it upon his shelf, only to be found the next morning a corpse, his body bent backward in a bow too dreadful for the living. A music hall impresario purchased it, and during a performance set it upon the stage as a novelty. The moment it began to play, the audience shrieked and stamped in time, their laughter becoming screams as blood spattered the velvet seats. Of the 100 who entered, only a dozen crawled out alive, deafened, bleeding, and raving. The impresario was never seen again, save for a smear of flesh across the box's brass inlay. By the 1860s, it passed into the hands of collectors who trafficked in grotesqueries, sold in secret auctions, held in candle-lit basements. It was said that certain gentlemen of rank purchased it to entertain their guests, for nothing, after all, stirred the jaded soul of the decadent like the suffering of others. Yet those who kept it too long fared ill. One baron was discovered wandering Hyde Park in his nightclothes, humming the tune with lips worn bloody, his fingers raw from turning an invisible key. A duchess was found seated before her fire, her head swaying in time to unheard music, her body long since cold. The devil's music box never burned, never rusted, never broke. When fire consumed a collector's house in Bloomsbury, all was ashes save for the blackened oak box, gleaming unmarked amidst the ruins. When a thief attempted to melt it for silver, the crucible shattered, and he was discovered headless beside his forge, though his lips still mouthed a silent refrain. It was as though the box fed upon each attempt to destroy it, drawing strength from every life it claimed. The last account, so far as any dare speak, comes from 1879. A young curate named Samuel O'Brien, earnest in faith but weak of will, acquired it from a dying antiquarian who begged him to cast it into the sea. Instead, O'Brien, tempted by curiosity, carried it to his parish and set it upon the altar, intending, as he swore later, to expose its evil under the gaze of Almighty God. Before his congregation, he wound the key. The tune began, soft, sweet, deceptively gentle, a lullaby. Mothers smiled, children swayed. The old wept with memories of youth. Then the notes deepened, grew discordant, clawing into hearts, pulling forth griefs and shames long buried. The congregation screamed as one and surged like puppets, their limbs jerking in a dance macabre. O'Brien himself was flung across the nave, his skull striking stone. When constables at last entered, they found the church filled with corpses, frozen mid-reel, their faces grinning skull masks of ecstasy and agony. Of the curate, nothing was found but a single finger lodged within the box's gears. Where the devil's music box now resides, no one knows. Some whisper it lies buried in the catacombs beneath London, locked in a chest bound with chains that tremble faintly with each passing night. Others insist it is carried still by a shadowy figure seen wandering the fog-bound streets, pausing at doorways to play its infernal song for the unsuspecting. Yet all tales agree. Should you hear a music box tinkling faintly in the dark, when no hand winds it, no child holds it, you must flee with all haste. For the devil's tune ensnares not the body alone, but the very soul, and those who dance to it will never cease, even in death. And so the dreadful rhyme persists among the children of Spitalfields, whispered in sing-song to keep them from wandering at night. Hush now, hush, the devil plays. Dance you must, till end of days. Key once turned, no prayer can save, for music calls you to the grave. Five. The Cursed Portrait. In the chill of early October, with the mist rolling low and thick across the Yorkshire moors, Jonathan Pritchard arrived at the estate of Baron Whitcomb, a client of some disrepute. The Baron had died a month prior, suicide, they whispered, and Jonathan, a young but ambitious antiquarian, had been commissioned by the Baron's estranged heir to catalogue the house's art collection before the auction. The estate was vast but crumbling, its red brick facade blotched with black mould, windows like blank eyes overlooking the dead gardens. The housekeeper, an aging mute named Mrs. Lyle, led Jonathan through the maze of dim corridors to the gallery on the second floor, never once meeting his eyes. As he entered the gallery, he felt it at once, a chill, not born of the autumn air, but of something older, like a breath exhaled from the walls themselves. The gallery was lined with dust-shrouded paintings, but one stood apart. It was massive, perhaps 7 feet high, and covered in a dark velvet cloth. A single wax candle sat on a stool in front of it, recently burned down. Pinned to the cloth was a note in the late Baron's hand. Do not uncover. Do not stare. Do not remain in its gaze. Of course, Jonathan uncovered it. He was a man of reason, of enlightenment. A painting, no matter how grotesque, could not do harm. And besides, he was being paid to evaluate it. He pulled the velvet away and felt his throat tighten. The portrait was masterfully done, lifelike in the most unnatural way. It depicted a woman in her late 20s, seated stiffly in a high-backed chair. She wore a gown of black mourning silk, and her hands were folded delicately in her lap. Her hair was chestnut brown, her expression solemn. But it was the eyes that arrested Jonathan. They were too vivid, too full of life, too aware. A painted gaze that met his own and would not release him. He stepped back. Something about her face stirred a memory, but it darted away before he could seize it. The frame bore no signature, but the back of the canvas had a crude marking. VL 1843. The year Baron Whitcomb's first wife, Lillian, had died. No portrait of her had ever been known to exist. And yet, here she was. Over the next few days, Jonathan worked late into the evenings, but he found himself returning to the portrait over and over. He began dreaming of the woman, Lillian, if it was indeed her. Dreams of her weeping blood, of her fingers crawling from the frame like pale spiders. He told himself they were merely nightmares. Still, he began to speak aloud to the painting, half mocking himself for the habit. But the worst part, what gnawed at his mind, was this. Every time he entered the gallery, her posture had changed just slightly. One day her fingers overlapped differently. Another, her neck turned half a degree more toward him. And her eyes, oh God, those eyes, they followed him now. Not metaphorically, truly. On the 5th day, Jonathan discovered a journal tucked beneath a false panel in the gallery's writing desk. It belonged to Baron Whitcomb, dated 1843. I begged her to pose, he wrote. She refused. The artist came anyway. She screamed when she saw the likeness. I paid the man to finish it in secret. When she found it again, something changed in her. She ceased to speak, ceased to eat. She wasted away until she was barely breath. But the painting grew more vivid, more complete. Her blush returned in the canvas long before it did in her cheeks. And after she died, I swear on my title, I saw her breathing within it. The final entry was short. She whispered last night. From the frame, I have nailed the cloth over her face, but she watches still. That night, Jonathan resolved to destroy the portrait. He brought a knife from the kitchen, heavy and sharp, and approached the painting by candlelight. The house groaned with wind. The portrait seemed almost to pulse with color now, as if Lillian had fed on the very walls around her. Her lips, once flat, now bore the hint of a smile. He raised the knife. Her eyes blinked. He screamed and stumbled back, the candle flying from his hand. The gallery went dark, but in the flickering light of the fallen flame, he saw her shape, not within the frame, but stepping out of it. Lillian. Her gown trailed oil and canvas behind her. Her hands were wrong, bent backwards at the knuckles, her mouth slowly widening into a silent scream. Jonathan fled. He ran blindly down the stairs, into the drawing room, only to find every painting in the house uncovered. All of them. Faces twisted, eyes watching. From upstairs came the sound of footsteps, impossibly slow and wet. Jonathan tried to escape through the front door. It was bolted shut. They found him 2 days later, after the vicar insisted the estate be checked. Jonathan's body was discovered impaled on the easel, the knife buried through his throat. The entire gallery was drenched in blood, but only his. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, but the portrait had changed. Lillian was still seated in her chair, still solemn, but in her lap now lay a small object, a man's leather-bound journal, and her lips bore the barest trace of satisfaction. Months passed. The heir, now rid of the burden of the estate, allowed the collection to be sold. All except one painting. No gallery would accept it. No buyer would touch it. They say it remains in a locked room beneath the London Museum, sealed behind a brick wall. But on cold nights, when the guards make their rounds, some say they hear a woman weeping softly behind the stones, but not for herself, for her next guest. Six. The crimson lace. The gown arrived in a box of cedarwood and satin, its lace bodice the color of dried blood, and the silk train dark as a moonless sky. It bore no card, no note, no mark of origin, only a scent of old perfume, and the faintest trace of something burnt. It was delivered to Dorsham House, a grand estate nestled between the heaths of Northumberland and the edge of a stone forest, where winters howled like wounded dogs and sunlight came only in whispers. Eleanor Bainbridge, newly engaged and scarcely 22, found the package on her writing table. The box was addressed to her in a firm, masculine hand she did not recognize. Her first instinct was to summon her maid, but some morbid curiosity stilled her hand. As she lifted the gown, it seemed to shudder in her grasp, the lace humming beneath her fingertips like the drawn breath before a scream. It was exquisitely made, stitched by hand, she could tell, and tailored with unnerving precision, as though its creator had known the precise measurements of her spine, her ribs, the bend of her waist. She held it against her chest and turned to the mirror. The lace clung to her reflection like vines. That night, she wore it to the mirror again. Her fiancé, Julian, had not yet returned from London, and the house was too large, too quiet. She found herself whispering nonsense to the walls and pacing her room like a forgotten portrait. The gown made her feel seen, transformed. She did not see the crimson seam that formed slowly along her collarbone, nor the way the lace crept infinitesimally down her arms each night she wore it. By the third day, the servants had begun to whisper. Eleanor was not herself. She took no food. She spoke in a low, slurred voice, as though reciting things overheard in dreams. Her eyes were sunken, and her hands, once gentle, began to twitch in her lap like birds caught in a snare. Mrs. Greaves, the housekeeper, confronted her in the dressing room. "My lady," she said softly, That gown. It fits perfectly, Eleanor interrupted. It's unnatural. It weren't here before. It's not yours. Eleanor turned slowly and smiled. It is now. Mrs. Greaves noticed then the trails of lace creeping up her mistress's neck, threading into her scalp like veins of ivy. Her skin looked too tight, her lips too red, as if they'd been stained. She tried to take the gown. She never made it to the door. The maid found her later, bent backward across the chaise, her mouth filled with threads. She had choked to death, though not on cloth, on blood. Julian returned that night, his carriage braving the moor fogs. He was shown immediately to Eleanor, who received him in the drawing room, wearing the crimson gown and humming a song he could not place, though it seemed oddly familiar. Something from childhood, perhaps. A lullaby turned sour. "My love," he said, "what's happened to you?" "I've become what you always wanted," she whispered. "Beautiful." The lace now reached to her jawline. It moved, he swore, as though breathing with her. And the longer he looked, the more he realized. It wasn't stitched. It had taken root, like it had burrowed through her flesh. That night, Julian tossed the gown into the hearth while Eleanor slept, hoping to destroy it. But it did not burn. It only writhed, blackened at the edges, and released a stench of charred meat and rosewater. When he turned back to the bed, Eleanor was awake. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. The next morning, Julian's body was found in the stables, trampled to a pulp beneath the hooves of horses that no longer lived. The stable boy who found him fled screaming, swearing the horses were made of lace. Eleanor vanished from the estate soon after, or so the papers said. But on quiet nights, the staff would hear weeping in the east wing, followed by the slow, dragging sound of silk across oak. When they dared to open the door, they found only the faint scent of old perfume and red fibers threaded through the floorboards like veins. The local seamstress, an old woman half mad with grief, confessed months later that she had once known a tailor named Romulus Black, famed for his gowns, despised for his cruelty. After his daughter hanged herself wearing one of his creations, he went mad and vowed to stitch a gown so perfect no woman could ever take it off. He said it would love her, she whispered, clutching her rosary, even if it had to grow teeth to keep her. No grave was ever found for Eleanor Bainbridge. But in the ruined chapel just beyond the Dorsham Wood, villagers have seen a figure dancing slowly at dusk, graceful, regal, and dressed in crimson lace that moves in the windless air. Some say she is cursed, others say she is beautiful. None say it twice. And those who get too close find red fibers in their mouths, between their teeth, in their throats. Threads that wind ever tighter with every breath, until the silence returns, and the lace hungers again. Seven. The Bone Clock. Circa 1877, Lancashire. No one in Bramblewick could remember when the bone clock first appeared. The ancient timepiece stood in the crumbling rectory atop Sycamore Hill, overlooking the fog-laden village below. Its case was wrought from blackened oak, tarnished brass, and ivory gears not of any known beast. It was said the pendulum was carved from the thigh bone of a child. Sacrifice, some whispered. None dared to open the case, and none had heard it tick in decades. Still, the hands always moved. When Dr. Elijah Penmore, a failed anatomist from Edinburgh, inherited the rectory from a distant uncle in the winter of '77, the townsfolk of Bramblewick were wary. He arrived alone, a widower with black-gloved hands, a leather satchel filled with surgical tools, and the sickly scent of embalming fluid clinging to his greatcoat. He saw the bone clock the moment he entered the rectory. It stood at the end of the hallway like a funeral sentinel. At once grotesque and beautiful, it commanded attention. Its glass face bore no numerals, only runes etched in bone. Its hour hand was a finger, the minute hand a sharpened femur shard. It ticks in time with death, the former groundskeeper had warned, refusing to even step foot in the manor. Penmore dismissed the superstition. That spring, the bodies began to vanish from the cemetery. One by one, graves were unearthed, never all at once, always a few days apart. The soil meticulously replaced, the coffins empty. Rumors spread like rot. Children whispered of a man in black who wandered the tombstones with a lantern, humming lullabies. Livestock were found mutilated, bones bleached white, organs removed with surgical precision. Penmore locked himself away in the rectory, blinds drawn, candles always lit. At night, strange noises echoed from the cellar, grinding, clanking, rhythmic tapping, and the bone clock began to tick. It was faint at first, just a soft tock, like the cracking of knuckles behind a door, then louder. With each stolen corpse, its pendulum swung wider, stronger. By midsummer, its ticking filled the halls like a metronome to madness. Lady Wensbridge, a local historian, paid Penmore a visit under the guise of academic curiosity. Her fiancé, Thomas Crowley, had vanished near the moor, and his empty grave now lay desecrated. "Surely you've heard what they say," she told Penmore, as she eyed the strange ticking timepiece. "They say it keeps time with souls." Penmore chuckled. "Souls do not measure in hours, my lady, but in tissues and calcium." That night she returned in secret, unable to sleep. She crept through a broken pane in the greenhouse and found her way into the cellar. What she saw broke her mind. A laboratory, stained with old blood, lit by whale oil lamps and filled with dissected remnants. Bones wired together with gold thread, sinew stitched like lace, faces stretched across porcelain molds. The centerpiece, a mechanical body, ribcage made of brass, heart encased in crystal, eyes of jet stone, and in its chest, the gearworks of the bone clock. Lady Wensbridge fled screaming into the night, her white gloves soaked in embalmer's fluid, she told the magistrate. They raided the rectory 3 days later. Penmore was gone. The laboratory had been gutted, the machine man destroyed, its remains burned in the hearth. But the bone clock remained, ticking louder than ever. They tried to remove it. It would not move. They tried to break the glass. It would not crack. One constable claimed the hands had changed direction, now spinning counterclockwise, faster each day. The vicar refused to speak of it. The townsfolk began to leave, one family at a time. By autumn, Bramblewick was nearly deserted. The snow returned in November. Lady Wensbridge, unable to find peace, returned once more to Sycamore Hill. Her fiancé's ring had been found in the cellar ashes. She wanted answers. The rectory stood silent and dark. She entered alone, the wind howling behind her. She found the bone clock exactly where it had always stood. But it was open now, its face cracked, its pendulum swinging with unnatural speed. Inside it was no longer a clock. It was a shrine. Fused bones, still wet with sinew, formed a cage around the core. a human heart, pulsing faintly, suspended by silver threads. Around it were teeth, dozens, each marked with a name. One of them was Thomas Crowley's. As she reached out, a voice spoke, not aloud, but behind her eyes. Time devours flesh, and you are late. The pendulum stopped. The clock struck 13, and Lady Wensbridge screamed. Her body was found days later in the moors, her chest cavity opened, ribs broken outward, as if something had clawed its way in. The rectory has been abandoned ever since. Yet on stormy nights, villagers say the bone clock still ticks atop the hill, counting the minutes backward, waiting for the next hour to strike, waiting for another heart to feed. The Whispering Orchard. In the parish of Terrebonne, where the churchyard stones lean like broken teeth and the moors breathe their chill vapours across the land, there stood an orchard unlike any other. Its apples were said to be sweeter than honey, its pears juicier than wine, and its blossoms so fragrant that lovers who strolled beneath them would swear their hearts beat faster. Yet none of the villagers ate its fruit. None dared walk between its crooked rows after sundown. For though the orchard was lush beyond reason, it was a place accursed, and the wind that passed through its branches carried voices not of birds or breeze, but of the dead. Long ago, the orchard had belonged to one Elias Dram, a farmer of grim reputation. Dram was a widower, whose wife perished mysteriously, her body never found. Rumour whispered he had buried her beneath the trees. Others swore that when she vanished, Dram's orchard blossomed twice as full. He was known to mutter to his trees at night, and many claimed to have seen him walking between them with a lantern, speaking to the shadows as though they answered him. In time, villagers heard voices drifting from the orchard, low and pleading, as though the very branches whispered prayers for release. One bitter autumn, the rector's daughter, Mary Wedge, vanished. Her bonnet was discovered snagged upon a thorn at the orchard's edge. The villagers, armed with lanterns and cudgels, stormed Drame's land. They found no Mary, but they found Drame hanged from one of his own apple trees, his tongue black, his eyes bulging, his toes scratching desperately in the dirt. Around his neck dangled not rope, but a length of his wife's braided hair. They buried him where he hung, but the orchard was left untended, and its trees grew wild and monstrous, their branches curling like claws, their fruits swollen and red as hearts. For years the orchard stood silent save for the sough of the wind. Then came the whispers. They began as faint murmurs, names called in voices long dead. A widower passing by swore he heard his wife weeping. A mother heard her lost child singing a lullaby between the trees. One man, half mad with grief, entered the orchard, convinced he would find his dead son waiting among the branches. He was discovered at dawn, hanging by his heels, gutted like a hog, his blood soaking the roots. Thereafter, none dared enter, yet poverty breeds courage, or folly. By the 1870s, Terrebonne had fallen to ruin, the mills closed, the soil barren. It was then that Jonathan Cray, a bankrupt merchant, arrived in the village. Cray purchased the orchard at a pauper's price, declaring he would harvest its bounty, and sell the miraculous fruit in London. The villagers warned him, muttering of curses and voices, but Cray scoffed. "An apple is an apple," he sneered, "and fear is but the diet of children." On the first night of his tenancy, Cray strode into the orchard with axe and sack. The villagers, from a cautious distance, saw his lantern bobbing among the twisted trunks. They heard him laugh, bold and scornful. Then came silence, followed by a sound that made every hair bristle. The faint, unmistakable murmur of voices, rising and falling like the tide. The lantern light swung madly, then was extinguished. At dawn they found him sitting beneath a tree, his face slack as wax. His eyes were wide, staring into nothing, and his lips still moved, mumbling ceaselessly, though no word could be understood. His hands clutched an apple, half eaten. The fruit inside was not white but crimson, its core writhing with worms. He lived 3 days in that stupor, whispering of a woman in the trees who beckoned him closer, who promised him riches, who kissed him with lips colder than earth. Then he fell still, his body stiff as bark, his skin pale and mottled. By evening, shoots had sprouted from his mouth, and before the week was out, a sapling grew from his chest, bearing blossoms the color of blood. Thereafter, the orchard changed. Its whispers grew louder, clearer. Villagers swore they heard Elias drown himself among them, bargaining, pleading, warning of a harvest yet to come. Sometimes the whispers laughed, a ghastly chorus that made cattle bolt and mothers clutch their babes. On certain nights, under the full moon, the trees moved. Not swayed as with wind, but moved, as though creeping an inch closer to the village with each passing month. A passing antiquarian, drawn by tales of the uncanny, visited Terrebonne in 1882. He ventured into the orchard armed with notebook and crucifix, intent on chronicling the phenomenon. His notes, discovered later, told of trees whose roots writhed like serpents, whose bark bore knots shaped like screaming faces. He wrote of whispers that grew into cries, into shrieks, into commands, voices urging him to feed the roots, to water the ground with flesh. The final entry read, "They know my name. They are beneath me. They are hungry." His body was never found, though his spectacles were discovered dangling from a branch, crusted with sap that resembled congealed blood. By century's end, the orchard was a place of pilgrimage for fools, curiosity seekers, and Satanists, all hoping to hear the whispers or to taste the forbidden fruit. Few returned. Those who did bore scars, or worse, their eyes hollow, their ears bleeding, their tongues babbling with secrets they should not know. One vagrant was discovered on London Bridge, shrieking that the orchard had roots stretching beneath the city, that its trees were fed not by soil but by corpses, and that soon the harvest would not be of apples, but of souls. He leapt into the Thames before he could be silenced. Years have passed, yet the orchard stands still upon Weeping Hill, its branches knotted like the fingers of the damned. On quiet nights, when the wind dies, the whispers carry far across the valley. Some swear they have heard their own voices calling back to them, faint and hollow, as though their souls were already claimed, already grafted to the orchard's roots. Those who linger too long say the air grows thick and perfumed, the sweetness of rotting fruit filling the lungs until every breath tastes of death. And if you dare walk the boundary at dusk, you may glimpse them through the branches, pale figures swaying where no wind moves, faces pressed between the leaves, lips working soundlessly. They do not beckon, they only watch, patient as the trees themselves, as though waiting for the day when every living thing in Terrebonne will take its place among them, when the orchard will no longer whisper, but sing, 9. The Silent Choir. In the parish of Dunwithy, long forgotten by the modern world and veiled in the mists that rise thick from its marshes, stood a ruin known only as St. Balthazar's Chapel. Its crumbling tower leaned like the broken tooth of a skull. Its roof collapsed into the nave, and its windows blackened with age. Few villagers dared walk past its gates, for it was said that within its cracked stone walls there was a presence more dreadful than death. The elders called it the Silent Choir. The tale was whispered in taverns over ale, in kitchens by firelight, and always with a trembling lip, that centuries ago the choir of St. Balthazar's had fallen under the sway of a cruel choirmaster named Osric Vale. Vale was a genius, it was said, with a voice that could raise heaven itself, but his methods were dark. He would beat the children who failed their notes, locking them for days in the crypt below until they came out pale, hollow, and voiceless. Some never came out at all. Then came the final mass, on a bleak midwinter's night, when Vale gathered his choir of 20 children before the high altar. Their voices swelled into a hymn that rattled the rafters and froze the marrow of all who listened, for the song was not Latin, but a tongue no one could understand. At its end, every choir boy and girl was struck dumb, their mouths open in eternal scream, but no sound issuing forth. They fell dead at once, and the church was abandoned from that hour. No bell tolled for them, no priest buried them. It was said that Osric Vale vanished into the storm, carrying with him a score of the cursed hymn written in his own hand. Years passed, centuries even, and St. Balthazar's fell into ruin. But the villagers swore that on winter nights, when the mist lay heavy on the marsh, and the moon gleamed faintly through clouds, a soundless procession could be seen within the church. Pale, childlike forms, with lips parted in song, their faces lifted toward the altar, their throats straining with invisible notes. They moved in unison, as if the hymn still bound them, though no sound escaped. This became the legend of the Silent Choir. It was into this desolate country that Joseph Dearborn arrived in 1889, a scholar of antiquities from Exeter. Dearborn had long sought forgotten hymns, chants and psalms, for he believed that music held power not yet fully studied by men of science. He rented a room above the inn and asked after St. Balthazar's, only to be met with narrowed eyes and muttered prayers. Old Mrs. Thorne, the innkeeper, spat into the fire when he spoke the church's name. "Best you leave it lie, sir," she warned. "There are songs no man should hear." But Dearborn was not to be dissuaded. By lantern light he made his way to the chapel that very night, braving the reeds and marsh frogs, the air thick with rot and mist. The ruin loomed before him, Gothic and black, its broken tower jagged against the stars. He forced open the rotted doors and stepped within. The silence was immense, not the silence of an empty ruin, but a silence that pressed against the ears like a hand, so complete it seemed to swallow the breath in his lungs. He lifted the lantern, and its glow fell upon the nave. There were no pews, only stones slick with moss, and at the far end, the remnants of an altar. Yet as he advanced, he froze, for he saw them. Rows of pale figures stood in the shadows, children in tattered cassocks, their eyes blank as bone, their mouths wide open. Their throats worked as if they were singing, but not a note pierced the air. Dearborn, trembling, whispered, "The Silent Choir." One child turned its head toward him. Its jaw strained wider, so wide the skin split at the corners, but still no sound came. Yet in his skull, Dearborn felt the hymn begin, not in his ears, but inside his mind. A rhythm of words not made for mortal throats, a music that clawed and tore at his sanity. He clutched his head, reeling as visions struck him. choirs of angels burning as they fell from heaven, cathedrals drowned in oceans of blood, and Osric Vale standing triumphant, his hand conducting the apocalypse. The children advanced, their bare feet silent on the stone, their mouths yawning impossibly wide. They surrounded him in a circle, the hymn growing louder in his brain until he thought his skull would split. He staggered to the altar, and there, beneath a slab, he saw it. A book of vellum, bound in human skin. The score of the cursed hymn, Vale's handwriting scrawled in black ink. Compelled by terror and awe, Dearborn opened it. The notes danced on the page, writhing like worms. Without knowing why, he raised his own voice and sang. The sound that issued from his lips was not his own. It was a shriek like the tearing of the earth, a cry that rattled the stones and made the choir still. They bowed their heads as though acknowledging a new master. But the hymn was not meant for mortal lungs. Blood burst from Dearborn's ears, his eyes, his nose, his skin split along his throat, and still the sound poured out, filling the chapel with a storm of invisible fury. The ruin trembled, stones fell from the broken tower, and when at last his body collapsed upon the altar, the voice did not cease. To this day, the people of Dunwithy say that St. Balthazar's sings again, not with the voices of its lost children, but with the endless, wordless cry of Joseph Dearborn, who became the new choirmaster of the damned. Travelers speak of hearing it carried on the wind, a song both silent and deafening, and those who dare to listen too long find themselves humming the melody without knowing why. Soon their voices vanish altogether, their mouths gape wide, and they join the procession in the ruin, lips parted in eternal song, members of the silent choir.